Welcome back to Made to Be Whole. Stay tuned for an episode on the healing effects of gratitude.
Made to be Whole is intended for informational purposes only. It's not intended to replace the advice or care of a licensed healthcare professional. Participating in this podcast does not constitute a provider-patient relationship with Krista Michener, AHP Integrative Health, or any of the guests featured on Made to Be Whole. Krista Michener, AHP Integrative Health, and any featured guests aren't responsible for any losses, damages, or liabilities that may arise from use of information obtained in this podcast or associated materials. Please consult a healthcare professional for any health-related concerns that you are experiencing.
Okay, this is Krista. Since Thanksgiving is upon us, I wanted to dive a little more into the scientific evidence that we have about the healing power of gratitude. And I will start with a quote by the recently departed Russell M. Nelson. He said, "The joy we feel has little to do with the circumstances of our lives and everything to do with the focus of our lives." And I think that is a really important eternal truth. Now, you notice joy is something that can exist even when you have trials, even when you have illness, even when you have challenges. We have some control over our circumstances, but not all. But we do have control over what we focus on. And an intentional gratitude practice can be very, very helpful. One of the things that I like to encourage people to do, tracking symptoms. So if I'm treating you for a chronic condition or for anything, it's really, really helpful to me if you track your symptoms. And I tell people it does not have to take very long. It could literally take 60 seconds for every day you to sit down and rate your top 3 symptoms and jot down anything that was different that day. If you started or stopped a medication or supplement, if you had some sort of accident or fall or stress or anything, different that we want to measure, your sleep was off. But how much longer would it take once a day to just write down one thing you're grateful for? Because it is so easy when our health is consuming, not by choice, but by circumstance, to focus on everything that's going wrong and all the things we have to do. But creating that practice of stopping to recognize what's going right can be really, really, really helpful. So if you were to go to like PubMed or Google Scholar or any of these other great databases and type in gratitude, you might be surprised at how many studies come up that give us really, really good data. So I'm going to show you, go over a summary of a few of the ones that I found. So one of them is from the Journal of Social Cognitive and Affective Neuroscience, but the title of the article, Evidence for a Role of the Oxytocin System Indexed by Genetic Variation in CD38 in Social Bonding Effects of Expressed Gratitude. So they're looking some at these genetic variants, but because some people have varying abilities based on genetics as far as oxytocin release, and oxytocin is that bonding hormone. It's released with breastfeeding. It's released during childbirth. Pitocin is synthetic oxytocin, but oxytocin affects our bonding ability greatly. But expressed gratitude can affect oxytocin production and it can increase bonding. And I would definitely say you don't have to be a scientist if you stop and observe in relationships where gratitude is expressed regularly, it's a lot easier to feel close to someone. And that can be in a marriage or intimate relationship. It can be with parent-child, siblings, even with coworkers. I think about my children who are really, really good about expressing gratitude to me and their dad, and there are a couple of them that are extra, extra good at it. But I love all of my kids, but it's really hard not to love someone, even if they're making dumb choices, if they're always thanking you for what you've done for them. Gratitude covers a multitude of sins, I would say, and that affects our closest relationships. So think of ways not just to record gratitude or to I don't know, cognitively process things you're thankful for, but actually expressing gratitude can be really, really healing and can be a benefit to your relationships, especially relationships that can be challenging. Sometimes it takes a little extra effort, but it can go a long way. So another article called The Neuroscience of Gratitude and Its Effects on the Brain. So this article basically references a bunch of other science. This is from positivepsychology.com by Dr. Melissa Madison. But she summarizes by saying the neuroscience of gratitude shows it activates brain regions associated with reward, enhancing feelings of contentment and emotional well-being. Regular practice of gratitude can lead to long-term positive changes in the brain, supporting mental health and resilience. And one of the easiest things that you can do is keeping a gratitude journal. So I do know people who they keep a journal that is for the specific singular purpose of keeping track of things they're grateful for. And so even in the context of illness, we'll dive a little into that. I don't think that most people are super, super grateful if they have Lyme disease or Babesia, that they have those things. But if you go through the things that you can be grateful in the context of that. So first of all, just having an accurate diagnosis is definitely something to be grateful for. My husband and I were just talking this morning and he said, "Do you remember what it was like when you had flares and we didn't know what was going on?" And I said, "Well, kind of, not refresh my memory. Like, what are you thinking of?" And he was pointing out that there were times in years past before we had the diagnoses and the treatment that I would have days where I was just in bed all day because I couldn't function. I had horrible, horrible stomach pain. I had crippling anxiety. I had really severe depression. And so at this point, things are better. They're not perfect, but even when there is a flare, just the benefit of knowing what's going on and why I'm feeling that way is a tremendous, tremendous blessing. So gratitude also has been like correlated in the literature with resilience, that ability to bounce back and tackle things when things don't go our way. Because if you've lived very long, you know that things are often not going to go your way. And you can be a victim of that, or you can develop resilience. And gratitude can help you develop that resilience. One of the other things you can be grateful for in the context of illness of any kind, we're always talking on this podcast and my practice about these pesky vector-borne infections. But as you pass through hard times, if you allow yourself to, you can develop the capacity to be a much kinder person. And you develop the capacity to comfort and empathize with others in a way that you just simply would not be able to without having experienced that. So I was listening to Dr. Jared Halverson. He's actually a religion and history professor, but he talked about the authenticity that people have when they've experienced hard times themselves. They're much more effective in their work, and especially if they're called vocationally or otherwise, to help others. You've probably been in a situation where you've had a healthcare provider or a counselor or maybe clergy or family who try to provide comfort, but how much more, I don't know, affirming is that when it's somebody who's been there, who get what you're going through. So you can be grateful through difficult times that you are developing the ability to help others. You also gain knowledge that you wouldn't have otherwise. And some of the knowledge we probably can say to ourselves, yeah, I could live without that. But I find it fascinating that you have people who are not healthcare professionals, but because of what they've passed through, are able to help other people find what's going on with them and direct them to resources. They're able to be kind of a guiding star for others, not just in comforting them, but in sharing their knowledge and experience. And that's a very, very powerful thing. It is very tempting to want our circumstances to change and to beg God, for those of you who pray, to change your circumstances. I don't think that he frequently does that, but he can give us the power to change our circumstances. And what you really, really want to do is not just say, oh, I have all these hard things happening. I want them to go away. I want them to go away. We have to have our boohoo moment, but then we really, really need to dive in and say, okay, what can I learn? What can I do for this to be better? So there's kind of an interesting scripture, and it's talking about, it's when Joseph Smith, who was the founder of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, was in a really, really awful jail for a period of months, that there was a lot of abuse going on to the community. The members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints were driven from many cities. At that time in Missouri, there had been an extermination order signed by the governor. So you had people who were being raped, their houses burned down, pillaged, driven from their homes. And he's rotting in a jail that's just absolutely filthy and vile on false charges. And he receives this answer. He says, if thou art called to pass through tribulations, and then there's this long, detailed list of all the things that have and are going to happen: false accusations, being taken from his family, his son crying and saying, Father, what are they going to do with you? He says, and if thou should be cast into the pit or into the hands of murderers, and the sentence of death passed upon thee, thou be cast into the deep. If the billowing surge conspire against thee, if fierce winds become thine enemy, if the heavens gather blackness and all the elements combine to hedge up the way, and above all, if the very jaws of hell shall gape open the mouth wide after thee, know thou, my son, that all these things shall give thee experience and shall be for thy good. The Son of Man hath descended below them all. Art thou greater than he? So all of our challenges, even though they're very, very painful in the midst of them, they can give us experience that can be consecrated for our gain, not just our personal growth, but our ability to help others. And I also thought it was interesting, the phrasing, if thou art called to pass through tribulation. As life goes on, I'm more and more convinced that some of our challenges are just because life is really hard and mortality is difficult and we live in a fallen world. But sometimes I feel like our challenges are chosen for us, that we're called to them. And from my perspective, if there's anything that we're called to do, God's not going to ask us to do something with helping us get through it. And I don't say that to be cheesy and you should just skip and smile. It won't be really hard. But I really, really do think that everything we pass through, there is help available. Now, one of the things that I think robs us of gratitude is comparison. And I see it happening on a couple different sides. I see people comparing themselves with others and their perception of others' lives. And we have this really difficult trap as humans where we will compare our weaknesses with someone else's strengths. And that's really not fair. Now, it can go the other way. You can compare your strength with someone else's weakness and get caught into this pride cycle, which is also really, really toxic. But I feel like I deal more with people saying, oh, look at this great thing someone else is doing and look at how terrible I am at this. And they're just not being fair. They're not looking at the full picture. Theodore Roosevelt is the one who has been quoted as saying, comparison is the thief of joy. So this was a speech that he gave in Paris in 1910, but I think it's a really, really apt truth that comparison can really rob ourselves of true joy because we're focusing on others. And as I said, a lot of times our perception of others and their circumstances, we're often not even like right on because we have limited information, but it can rob us of joy. And I found a blog called The Plain Simple Life, theplainsimplelife.com, and she goes through and gives 10 reasons why comparison is the thief of joy. And one of them is that it stifles gratitude. She says comparison can also lead to a lack of gratitude for the things we do have. We become so focused on what others have that we forget to appreciate our own successes and accomplishments. True growth and success usually happens incrementally. So one of the other, I think, real benefits of journaling, but a gratitude journal, and also keeping track of your symptoms and those sorts of things that I think it's tempting to not want to write about or record because we don't think about it. If you're someone who already spends a large portion of your day dealing with your health and dealing with pills and procedures and appointments, you just think, why would I want to sit and write about this? I want to escape. But by keeping records, we can help cultivate gratitude because we have a more accurate perception of what's going on. We can look back and say, I'm struggling with X right now, but I forgot that a year or 2 or 5 or 10 years ago, I used to have this other problem all the time, and I don't really deal with that anymore. Our healing usually happens in degrees, and so our practice of gratitude can be really, really helpful in our perception of that. A couple of other things that she points out on this blog that comparison can do: it hinders growth because it stops you from seeing your own potential, and it can be kind of paralyzing. And then you're much less likely to try new things or take on new challenges. Remember that comparison is not only going to hold you down emotionally, but it could really, really hurt your progress. It can help us set unrealistic standards. Our standards should be based on truth and our actual abilities and circumstances, not our perceptions of what everyone else is doing or what the perfect life is. It can lead to low self-esteem, especially, as I said, if you're comparing your weaknesses with someone else's strengths. You can feed this negative spiral. And it really, I think, also gets us into a more self-centered mindset. I think it's a real challenge to hold space for things that seem competing, but they're actually not. So, for example, you can be going through something really, really difficult and really painful and have a lot to be grateful for at the same time. I know that's a challenge, but it's absolutely true. And I think it's disingenuous, as I've said before, to not acknowledge the pain. But on the other side, you have to acknowledge the good stuff. And when I was talking to my son Daniel about this podcast, he said, and I quote because I thought it was wise, so I jotted it down, "I think having the right attitude sets the tone for your body." And if you think about how physically you feel different when you're focused on gratitude and positive things, it is more than just your mind, it's your body as well. So how do we find the ability to do that when things are really, really not going our way? I had an experience somewhat recently where it was a Saturday and I had a lot of things to do, as I'm sure most of you do, but a lot of things to do for my family, a lot of things to do for my patients. But I was having a really, really bad flare and I was having crippling pain. My head felt like it was in a vice, things bad. And I just was praying and begging and pleading, just take this away because I have so many things to do, and I wasn't getting anywhere. And so I finally changed my prayer to, okay, if this isn't going to go away, help me figure out what to do to get through it and help me figure out what I'm supposed to learn from it. So one of the things that Joseph Smith wrote in these letters that he wrote to church members as they were being persecuted, he was giving them counsel, but one of the things was that they cheerfully do all things within their power. And I really like that because, first of all, it implies that there are things that aren't in our power, and we have to let those go. There are things that are absolutely not in our power. But what is in our power? If in that circumstance, on that bad Saturday, I could say, there's nothing for me to do. I can't physically do anything, but it occurred to me, it is in my power to go lie down. It's Saturday. I don't have to be at work. There are a lot of things that I want to do and need to do, but I can go lay down. And as I've thought about it, the times in my life that have led me to be in bed for a half hour or a couple of hours, or in the past a couple of days, have kind of become sacred times because as you're lying there, sometimes you can sleep. That's great. Sleep's fantastic. It's healing. But even if I can't, when we're still, we can cultivate relationships, we can refine our thoughts, we can come to know God better. There's scripture in the Old Testament to be still and know that I'm God. And I've learned a lot from being still. And I think about the conversations that I've sometimes had with family members as I'm lying in bed, and I could focus on what I can't do, all the things I can't do around the house. But sometimes those are some of the best conversations I've had with my kids and with my husband, because I'm not trying to multitask, because I'm not able to. And we've had good conversations. I remember years ago hearing the story of this woman who, she had laryngitis. She couldn't talk. She was really sick. Her kid came home and said, "Oh, Mom, I had such a hard day." And they talked and talked and talked. And she felt so bad because she couldn't give advice. She couldn't comfort. She couldn't answer back. The kid talked for a while and gave her a hug and said, "Thanks, Mom. I feel a lot better." And she realized that sometimes her ability to counsel and give advice and comfort stood in the way of her being quiet and listening. And actually, that's what was needed the most. Ways to express gratitude. Prayer is a great way to express gratitude. Journaling is a great way to express gratitude. Just verbally thanking people for what they do for you. My daughter Isabel, who's a little introverted, she makes these little, she calls them love notes. So she's an artist, and she makes these tiny little notes where she has drawings and phrases expressing gratitude and encouragement, and she'll just give them to people who look like they're having a hard day. And I think that's another way, harnessing the talents and abilities that you have. You don't have to be someone who goes and talks to people if you're an introvert. But find another way to express gratitude. It absolutely works. So there was one other study that I wanted to cite, about the physiological effects of gratitude. Um, and I think it's important to say, before I get to that, that a lot of the benefits that gratitude has can't necessarily be measured scientifically. I mean, there are some things that can be measured. We talked about oxytocin release, and there are other things that we can look at. But how we feel, the lightness we feel in our life, I think by itself is absolutely worthy of the effort. So the final article I'll cite is from the journal called Brain Behavior and Immunity. So think about that, our immune systems, how they are affected by what goes on in our minds. The title of the article is Exploring Neural Mechanisms of the Health Benefits of Gratitude in Women, a randomized control trial. So if you're looking at scientific articles, even if you don't understand all of the methods and the statistical measurements, most articles have an abstract at the beginning that summarize results. And I think for something like this, if you're not publishing your research, you can still take some good things from there, but they give a little highlight of what happens. So increases in support giving were associated with reductions in amygdala activity. So your amygdala gets a lot of that fight or flight, panicky narrative in your head going. So as people had increased support giving activity, that calmed the amygdala down. The amygdala being calmed down, reductions in that activity were associated with reductions in inflammation. So actual physiological markers of inflammation were improved. And then amygdala activity mediated the relation between support giving and inflammation. So that was the part of the brain that was affecting this process. And then they summarized by saying gratitude may benefit health through the threat reducing effects of support giving. There are a lot of people who have a lot of reasons to feel threatened, because anybody who's been alive for very long has had some degree of trauma in their life, some people much more than others. And perceived threats can be blown out of proportion. Perceived threats can be very, very real. But if we focus solely on those, we're going to be paralyzed. And there are actually physiological things that change when you become supportive to others, you express gratitude, and you become part of this process. So as the Thanksgiving season descends upon us, I would just encourage people to cultivate a practice of gratitude. It's not something that takes a long time. It does take a conscientious effort, but I would encourage you when you're feeling overwhelmed and you don't have much to give, can you sit and think about the things that you are grateful for and the things that are going right? There are things beyond your control, but as you focus on things within your control, you'll be less paralyzed, you'll feel more hope, you'll find more healing, and you'll have a better life. So enjoy your holidays and remember to have hope because you were made to be whole.
Have a podcast question or suggestion? Text or call us on the podcast info line at 330-439-0686. Thank you for spending time with me today. If you like what you hear, please subscribe to be notified when new episodes release. And remember, you were made to be whole.